Hi, it's Congressman David Schweikert, and wanted to focus a little bit on what the Democrats are moving today here in Congress. They refer to it as their inflation bill. It's basically the previous Build Back Better bill pared down and adjusted. And I wanted to talk about some of the things that are frustrating to those on the conservative side. But understand, you're going to hear lots of discussion about the 87,000 IRS agents, the tax hikes on the middle class, the tax hikes on small business. But my fear is we don't do a good enough job explaining that this is part of the philosophical difference between the right and the left. This is substantially a subsidy bill. If you promise to buy a certain type of car, you get a subsidy. If you do certain types of solar panels, you get a subsidy. But it's even worse than that. In regards to drug pricing, we do something, it would be very helpful, but it's the wrong mechanism, is telling seniors after a few years from now, we're going to cap your drug expense to $2,000. But instead of approaching it to lower the price of drugs, we're functionally going to take taxpayer money and put it into the pockets of big pharma while protecting seniors. It's a subsidy to the very institutions, businesses that we complain about. So I want to walk through what would have been a Republican alternative in making some of these things work. Instead of a subsidy model, how about a competition model where you bring more competition to market? You actually embrace disruptions in technology, in business models, in way we do things. Because 5 years from now, which one will be permanent? A model where we're subsidizing much of the economy, or one where we've revolutionized, where we've actually brought disruption and technology improvements and made society cleaner, better, faster, more efficient, and more affordable. So let's actually hop on insulin, which is a personal fixation. Diabetes is an absolute fixation of mine if you've watched some of my other floor speeches. In this legislation, this is pared down from the previous bill, which was like $36 billion of subsidies to the insulin-making pharma. To now it's down to $6 billion for those who use insulin who are functionally on Medicare, Medicaid. But once again, it's reaching to that very person who needs insulin, their tax dollars, and handing it to pharma to buy down the price of their insulin. It's absurd. Instead, we've been trying to pitch a different idea, and that is bring competition, bring disruption, bring other companies in. And here's a company, it's functionally a co-op being built not that many miles from Washington, D.C., that's actually a handful of drug companies and other groups that have gotten together. And this factory is only a year or two away from being up and running, where their price will actually be lower than the subsidized price that Congress just passed, without the money actually going to big pharma. It's because there's a new competition into the marketplace, lowering insulin prices. This is disruptive. This is permanent because it brings in more competition into the marketplace. This is a permanent solution. Well, what the Democrats once again are doing is they're taking your taxpayer money and handing it out to the very companies that they complain about. But this is a way of saying we did something. It doesn't have to be that way. We believe in making markets more competitive. Instead, the Democrats functionally are financing a society of oligopolies, of huge companies that have no competition because they also hold the subsidies. So I want to give you another perversity, and this is a simple example, but it's an example that is woven through this piece of legislation. There's about $2.6 billion of subsidies for ports. For us in Arizona, we care a lot about the Port of Long Beach, the Port of Los Angeles. But what they've done is saying $2.6 billion for clean equipment, environmentally sensitive equipment, except it must be managed and controlled by a human being. So the automation, the efficiencies that we need to fix our supply chains to be able to get things off these container ships and into our warehouses in Arizona isn't there. And it turns out it's actually not as clean, not as efficient, but once again, it subsidizes the very unionized longshoremen workers who are supporters of the Democrats and write checks to them. So we actually hold this up as a simple example. through a little bit of change in the regulatory code and some of the restrictions. This is actually automated freight cars that have been designed by some former SpaceX engineers that for like the Alameda corridor, a container drops off, these are electric motors, and it would just run it out to the warehouse or the distribution center it needs to be. Boom, boom. But because they're electric, because they're autonomous, the levels of efficiency and the environmental benefit, and also not having hundreds of trucks lined up, idling day after day after day, waiting to get their containers, it automates it. This is the future. Turns out, the way the Democrats have designed their legislation, this doesn't qualify because it doesn't have an operator. There's not a unionized longshoreman sitting there driving the equipment. So once again, it's an example of a lot of great virtue signaling in a piece of legislation. But the things that would actually be great for the environment, great to take on inflation, productivity, helping our prices and our lives become more prosperous, that isn't part of this bill. This bill is functionally virtue signaling and subsidies to the very groups that write checks to the Democrats. And so I'm trying to explain that difference between a subsidized economy and an economy with lots of disruption and competition that actually builds productivity, prosperity for the future. And so that's why you're going to see so many of us on the Republican side rail against this bill, do our best to stop it, but try to convince our brothers and sisters on the left there's a much better way to bring the next revolution to this economy of making it greener, fairer, less inflation, and just wealthier and more prosperous for the country.